The morning Darius Whitaker chose to walk the city alone began like countless others. His coffee had gone cold before he managed more than a few sips. A stack of briefings sat heavily on his desk, and beyond the window stretched the skyline he had spent his entire administration trying to rebuild. Darius was the first black mayor in Greyhaven's history. Most mornings, that distinction rested on him less like an honor than a reminder of how much work still remained. He dressed quietly while his wife slept, pulling on worn jeans, a dark canvas jacket with a frayed cuff, and an old gray baseball cap he had kept since his daughter's graduation. He slipped his city identification into the breast pocket beside a small paper notebook, the kind reporters once carried before every thought became digital, and left the house before his security detail arrived. His chief of staff, Maren Caldwell, had called him repeatedly beforehand. Her voice carried the particular strain of professional alarm she reserved for arguments she knew she was going to lose. She had urged him to bring at least one plainclothes officer. Greyhaven's downtown revitalization corridor represented a public investment of $230 million spread across 9 city blocks, and community complaints suggested the project was drifting badly off course. Contractors were billing the city for work that had not been completed. Independent subcontractors were being pushed aside in favor of politically connected firms. Beneath those concerns lay something even more troubling. Business owners and residents described a police presence that felt less like protection and more like intimidation. Maren wanted him accompanied. Darius refused. If the people who live and work there have to face that reality every day without backup, he had told her, his voice quiet and final, then I can spend one morning seeing it through their eyes. She had fallen silent, understanding his reasoning while disagreeing with the risk. Now Darius walked east along Bellwether Avenue as Greyhaven stirred awake around him. Delivery trucks rumbled over newly poured pavement that had arrived far behind schedule. A woman rinsed the sidewalk in front of her hair salon. Workers in hard hats leaned against a pickup that, according to the complaint files, had remained in the same place for days. Darius moved slowly and stopped often. He wrote in ink instead of using his phone, which was official, traceable, and too easily noticed. He had learned to think through problems on paper during his years on the city council, long before most residents knew his name. He photographed a cracked median listed as repaired in the project's opening phase. He recorded the address of a corner building where outdated permits still hung behind dusty glass. He counted damaged security cameras and compared them with the few that appeared operational. He was doing precisely what voters had elected him to do, paying attention to the details that official reports often missed, because those reports were usually written by the same people whose work they were meant to evaluate. Darius had been standing near the intersection of Bellwether and Alder when he noticed a patrol car slowing behind him. He did not turn immediately. He had lived long enough and listened carefully enough to the people who had filed those complaints to understand what a slowing police vehicle could mean when a black man stood on a public sidewalk in ordinary clothes, writing in a notebook. He closed his pen. He kept his posture open. Then he turned slowly with the deliberate calm of someone who had nothing to hide and everything to lose. Officer Grant Hollis had served on the force long enough to believe he possessed an instinct for reading situations. What he actually possessed was a collection of assumptions so deeply embedded in his thinking that he no longer recognized them as assumptions. They had hardened into what he called perception, judgment, and street experience. Grant was broad-shouldered, confrontational by nature, and carried a complaint file that supervisors had reviewed 4 separate times without ever finding sufficient reason to discipline him. The complaints varied in detail, but they followed a familiar rhythm. Escalated encounters involving black men in commercial areas, unnecessary command language during routine stops, and 2 formal accusations of racial profiling quietly closed without findings. A 3rd allegation had come from a retired teacher detained outside a pharmacy while carrying nothing more suspicious than prescription medication and a wallet. The matter had been labeled inconclusive after a single interview and no meaningful follow-up. The file remained in a drawer at the district station, growing heavier with every addition. Grant continued his patrols as though that drawer did not exist. He had noticed Darius from down the block, a black man in working-class clothes standing near the development corridor, taking notes and photographing buildings. That was everything he had actually observed. The story he built from those facts formed almost instantly. The shops were not fully open. A business had recently been broken into farther down the corridor. Grant pulled to the curb and stepped out with the purposeful stride of a man who believed the ending had already been decided. "Hey!" he shouted before reaching Darius. "Stop right there!" Darius stopped and turned. Grant approached with both hands on his belt. "What are you doing out here?" Darius met his gaze without challenge or submission. "I'm walking the development corridor and documenting the construction progress." Grant's eyes moved from the notebook to the phone, then to the worn jacket. "Documenting it? You work for someone?" "I do," Darius replied. "May I ask what the concern is?" "I'll ask the questions. Do you have identification?" Darius reached slowly into his breast pocket, both men aware of the choreography demanded by the moment, and handed over his city-issued card. Grant glanced at it briefly, then returned it with the dismissiveness of someone who had already decided the document could not matter. "This doesn't explain why you're standing in front of these businesses writing things down. These are new properties. There's been criminal activity nearby." "I'm not involved in any criminal activity," Darius said. "I'm a public employee conducting an official inspection of a city project." Grant's expression hardened. The phrase public employee seemed to land somewhere between amusing and insulting. "What kind of public employee?" "The kind with oversight responsibility for this corridor." People began noticing the exchange. A woman walking a small dog paused across the street. A teenager on a bicycle slowed nearby. Grant stepped closer, reducing the space between them in a calculated display of dominance. "You're telling me you're out here early in the morning with no uniform, no official vehicle, and no protective gear, and you expect me to believe you work for the city?" "I'm asking you to verify it." "Put your hands on the hood of my vehicle." "I'd like to understand the legal basis for that order." "Hands on the hood, now." Darius looked at the patrol car, then back at Grant. I understood with painful clarity that the distance between where he stood and where his authority resided was exactly as wide as the officer before him chose to make it. He walked to the cruiser and placed his hands on the warm hood. The neighborhood began to gather gradually, then all at once, as though people had been waiting for a signal they had not known they were expecting. A man in a restaurant apron appeared in a nearby doorway, drawn by the particular silence that descends when official power is being used against an ordinary person in an ordinary place. A woman sitting in a parked car stepped outside with her keys still in hand. She did not know what she intended to do, but she knew she could not drive away. The teenager remained on his bicycle, his stillness becoming a choice rather than an accident. An older man with a cane stopped at the curb. His expression held no surprise. It was older and heavier than surprise, the look of someone watching a familiar story unfold in a familiar setting. A woman carrying groceries stopped before reaching her destination. A teenage girl emerged from a phone shop, folded her arms, and watched with a jaw held tightly in control. These people did not know one another. They had not planned to meet there. They had simply stepped out of Greyhaven's ordinary morning and found themselves witnessing something each recognized from different lives and different angles. They stayed because leaving felt like permission. Grant moved behind Darius and began asking questions loudly enough for the sidewalk to hear. They were not questions offered in good faith. They were tools meant to support a conclusion he had already reached. "Where do you live?" Darius told him. Grant repeated the address as though it were unbelievable. "Who do you work for?" "The city." "I heard that. Who specifically?" "The mayor's office." The crowd shifted. "You're saying you work directly for the mayor?" "Yes." Grant almost laughed. "What exactly do you do?" "Oversight and compliance." Grant took the identification card again and examined it with the scrutiny he had refused to give it moments earlier. His eyes moved from the card to Darius and back, searching for the flaw he was certain must exist. "This could be fake." "It isn't. You could have had it made." "I didn't." "You expect me to believe you hold an official position while walking around alone, dressed like a construction worker?" Darius paused. The sun had risen above the buildings, laying warm light across the sidewalk without discrimination. It illuminated the witnesses, the patrol car, the mayor standing with his hands on the hood, and the officer who had not looked beyond his assumptions long enough to understand what stood in front of him. "Officer," Darius said quietly, "I have answered every question. I provided identification and explained my purpose. I am asking you, as calmly as I know how, to consider that you may be making a serious mistake." Grant reached for his handcuffs. "You can explain the rest at the station." The metallic sound was not loud, but it carried. The woman with the dog covered her mouth. The man in the apron stepped forward, then stopped himself. The teenager raised his phone. Grant locked the cuffs around Darius's wrists with the efficiency of routine and spoke loudly for the crowd. "If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to worry about. This is standard procedure." Darius said nothing. He looked at the new pavement poured behind schedule, the failed security cameras, the outdated permits, and the city he had devoted himself to rebuilding. A grief settled inside him that had nothing to do with personal humiliation. This was what the complaint forms had been describing. Not a statistic, not a concept. This feeling, this street, these handcuffs. Darius murmured a brief phrase in Vietnamese, a language he had learned from his first counsel mentor, Dr. Celeste Tran. She had taught him that some truths were best spoken in languages power did not recognize, because power defended itself most aggressively against anything it perceived as a threat. Then he repeated himself in English, with the same controlled tone he had maintained throughout the encounter. "You are making a very serious mistake. I am telling you this as information, not as a challenge. In my experience, people are sometimes grateful to receive that information before a situation becomes irreversible rather than afterward." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Grant's face. It lasted only a moment, the narrow space in which another version of the morning might have become possible, a version in which he paused long enough to see Darius as a person instead of the story he had already assigned him. The hesitation vanished. Grant guided him toward the rear of the cruiser. "We'll see about that," he said with the comfortable confidence of a man who had never been wrong in a way that cost him anything real. He placed Darius in the back seat and closed the door. The witnesses watched the patrol car leave. Several were already speaking into their phones, describing precisely what they had seen, because they understood that details mattered and that details were always in danger of being denied. The district station's processing room had the flat, fluorescent atmosphere of bureaucratic spaces everywhere. Harsh lights made everyone look ill. Laminated signs listed rights and procedures. Burned coffee and floor cleaner hung in the air. Grant walked Darius inside with one hand on his arm, signed him in at the desk, and directed him to a bench while paperwork began. The intake officer, Nolan Pierce, glanced at Darius and then at Grant. The look lasted slightly too long, but he said nothing. Officers learned early that speaking up often carried a cost. Darius sat with his cuffed hands in his lap and waited. His stillness was not an act. It was the practiced composure of a man who had spent his career in rooms where the wrong expression could end a conversation before it began. Before entering politics, he had served as a public defender in Greyhaven. He knew rooms like this from the other side of the table. I understood that the way through an institution required patience, precision, and careful timing. He waited while Grant completed the report. He waited while Grant's supervisor, Lieutenant Everett Sloan, passed through without asking a question. Eventually, Grant turned toward him with studied casualness. "You can make one call. You should probably find a lawyer." Darius looked at him. "I would like to call the chief of staff in the mayor's office." Grant's expression changed in stages, like a structure shifting before it settled. "The chief of staff? That's right. You're still going with that story?" "It isn't a story. It is a phone call." Grant placed a phone on the table with the air of someone granting a pointless concession. "Go ahead." Darius regarded him with something that was not quite pity and not quite sorrow, though it held traces of both. He dialed Marin Caldwell's direct number from memory. She answered immediately. She had not stopped being alert from the moment he left home without protection. Her first call went to Police Chief Gideon Park, whose relationship with Darius had been built through years of difficult but productive disagreement. Her next calls went to the deputy mayor and the city attorney. She spoke in the compressed, decisive language of someone trained for crisis. Chief Park was reaching for his keys before she finished. The deputy mayor began issuing internal alerts. The city attorney opened department misconduct protocols while contacting the district captain. The station phone began ringing before Grant returned to the room. Lieutenant Sloan answered the first call, and the color shifted in his face. He answered another call while standing. By the time the phone rang again, he was moving quickly toward processing with the expression of a man being forced to reconstruct a decision he now understood had been unsound from the beginning. Sloan appeared in the doorway and looked at Darius sitting on the bench, then at Grant standing nearby. Recognition arrived instantly. He had seen Darius Whitaker's face in city briefings, newspapers, election materials, and official announcements. Yet his mind struggled to reconcile that familiar face with the mayor sitting handcuffed inside his station. For one long moment, Sloan said nothing. Grant turned toward him. Sloan stepped inside. His voice was careful. "Officer Hollis, who is this individual?" "A man I detained for suspicious behavior in the development corridor. He was uncooperative." Sloan's use of Grant's name rather than his title was the first sign that something had changed. What exactly was suspicious? Grant described the notebook, the photographs, the ordinary clothes, and what he called an unsatisfactory explanation. He used the clipped language of formal reports. As he spoke, Sloan did not look at him. He looked at Darius. Chief Gideon Park arrived soon afterward, with senior staff and a representative from the mayor's communications office. His entrance changed the pressure in the building before anyone saw him. Routine greetings became formal, voices lowered. Grant stood very still as his understanding of the morning began reorganizing itself around information he did not yet fully possess. Chief Park entered the processing room and stopped. Darius met his eyes with the same composure he had carried all morning. The chief crossed the room, removed the handcuffs personally, and said, "Mayor Whitaker, on behalf of this department, I am deeply and unreservedly sorry." Silence consumed the room. Grant stood only a few feet away as the blood drained from his face. Nolan Pierce did not move. Lieutenant Sloan remained frozen. Darius rose and rubbed his wrists once. Then he looked at Grant. He held the officer's gaze without speaking. That silence said more than any accusation could have. Darius turned to Chief Park. "We need to talk," he said, "but not here." The videos surfaced before Grant had finished drafting his report. The teenager on the bicycle had recorded an uninterrupted section of the encounter, showing Darius against the patrol car, his hands on the hood, his answers calm and precise, and Grant escalating despite complete cooperation. The woman with the dog had filmed the handcuffing from across the street. Her recording was clearer and captured Grant's expression when he declared that an innocent person had nothing to fear. A customer inside the nearby diner had filmed through the front window. The dry cleaner's exterior camera had recorded the entire encounter from a fixed angle, keeping both men visible from beginning to end. The separate recordings were quickly combined and aligned by their timestamps. Viewership expanded faster than the platform could comfortably support. Captions were added. The footage crossed the country and reached international newsrooms soon afterward. Nothing about what it showed was ambiguous. Darius had cooperated from Grant's first command. Every answer had been clear, measured, and legally appropriate. He had produced valid identification, which Grant dismissed without meaningful review. He had named his employer accurately. He had warned the officer in recorded audio that the encounter was becoming a serious mistake. Through it all, Grant's conduct reflected the same disturbing pattern described in the complaints hidden inside his file. Suspicion applied selectively to black men, an inability to accept information that contradicted his original assumption, and detention used not as a last resort, but as the first tool of control. City journalists obtained the public complaint records. The names of those who had filed them were protected, but the descriptions were not. The incidents echoed the footage from Bellwether Avenue with painful precision. Darius held a press conference in the City Hall briefing room. Marin Caldwell stood at one side of him and Chief Gideon Park at the other. Reporters expected anger, exhaustion, or visible humiliation. Instead, Darius appeared as though the encounter had clarified something he had long understood only in theory. He spoke without notes. "What happened to me was a violation of my civil rights," he said, "but it was also an illustration, captured clearly and preserved publicly, of what residents have been trying to describe in complaint forms, council meetings, and community forums for a long time. I explained that those residents had either not been believed or had been believed too weakly for their experiences to produce action. In practical terms," he said, "there was little difference between the two. The fact that I am mayor is not what made that detention wrong. It would have been wrong if I were a teacher, a librarian, a construction worker, or the man employed at the dry cleaner beside the place where it happened." His voice remained calm, but no one mistook calmness for softness. "This is not primarily about what happened to me. It is about what happens to people who cannot make a call that immediately changes how the system sees them. Those people deserve the same answer I received. They deserve it without delay, and they deserve a city that provides it without requiring public office to unlock it." Chief Park launched an internal affairs investigation that same day. It was not the first review of Grant Hollis's record. It was the first conducted with the institutional urgency required to produce a different result. Investigators connected to the earlier reviews were removed from the case. The new lead investigator, Lenora Hayes, was a respected department veteran with no prior involvement in Grant's files. She began collecting records immediately. What she uncovered became the most complete documentation of biased enforcement by a single officer in Greyhaven's recent history. The information was not new. What changed was the purpose with which it was assembled. Earlier reviewers had approached the complaints, searching for reasons to close them. Lenora approached them, searching for the truth. The stop data told one story. Grant detained black men in commercial areas at a rate nearly 4 times higher than white men under comparable circumstances. His written reports told another. In several disputed encounters, Grant's descriptions of threatening or evasive behavior did not match video recordings later recovered by investigators. In 3 of those cases, video evidence contradicted Grant's written account. In 2, the recordings had existed during the original reviews but had never been placed in the investigative files. Lenora presented her findings before Greyhaven's Civilian Review Board in a crowded public hearing. Community members who had submitted complaints filled the room. Journalists held recorders above open notebooks. City council members sat beside representatives of civil rights organizations that had monitored department enforcement patterns for a long time. Those organizations had previously submitted formal reports to the city without receiving any meaningful response. Lenora delivered her conclusions in the flat, declarative language of official investigation. The lack of emotion made every finding strike harder. Grant Hollis had violated use of force protocols on Bellwether Avenue. He had conducted an unlawful detention without reasonable suspicion. He had failed to review valid identification with appropriate care. His language and decision-making reflected a pattern of bias documented throughout his service record. Earlier internal reviews had failed to consider available evidence, and in some instances, investigators had personal or professional relationships with the officer whose conduct they were meant to evaluate. The City Council convened an emergency session. Civil rights advocates held a separate press conference. Legal experts appeared on local and national broadcasts to explain why the enforcement pattern met the legal standard for racial profiling. Darius made no additional public comments while the investigation remained active. He instructed Marin to redirect interview requests to the Civilian Review Board and City Attorney. Then he returned to work. He completed the corridor inspection through formal channels, accompanied by project auditors he perhaps should have brought with him from the beginning. He continued the slow, exacting work of governing a city that needed deeper repair than even its most honest reports had revealed. Grant was placed on administrative leave. His badge and weapon were surrendered at the district station in a brief transaction witnessed by a supervisor who never met his eyes. A lawyer representing him released a statement claiming that media coverage had distorted the encounter and that Grant had followed his training. By then, the recordings had been watched by so many people that they had become their own settled record. The attorney did not identify which actions in the footage reflected legitimate department training. No meaningful clarification followed. The review board's final determination recommended Grant's dismissal on 3 independent grounds: violation of civil rights, a sustained pattern of racially biased enforcement, and false statements in official reports. It also demanded a fresh examination of the earlier internal investigations and a formal review of the supervisory structure that had repeatedly closed the complaints without findings. Chief Park accepted every recommendation. He signed the termination order, and Grant Hollis was informed that his law enforcement career had ended. The state began a separate review of his professional certification. Given the evidence, permanent decertification appeared inevitable. Grant later returned to the station under supervision to collect his belongings. He carried out a cardboard box containing a family photograph, a chipped coffee mug, and a small bottle of aspirin kept in his locker. The supervising officer held the door open. Grant walked through without looking back. The door closed behind him with complete indifference, moving exactly as it would have for anyone else. Only later did those who watched him leave understand that the most striking thing about his departure was how ordinary it appeared. A career ended not with sirens, speeches, or applause, but with a cardboard box and a closing door. Darius stood at his office window after the dismissal was finalized, looking across the skyline he had worked so hard to rebuild. He held two truths at once: satisfaction that the correct decision had finally been made, and grief over what the decision represented. Grant losing his badge was not justice for everyone whose complaints had been ignored. It was a beginning. The more difficult work involved examining the architecture that had allowed an officer with that record to remain in service. It meant confronting review systems that assign friends and colleagues to investigate one another, supervisors who treated video evidence as optional, and leaders who found comfort in closing files instead of resolving the harm described inside them. The ending of one career was not the reform of an entire department. Darius knew how easily individual accountability could become a substitute for systemic accountability. He had watched institutions celebrate one visible consequence while leaving untouched the conditions that had made it necessary. Soon afterward, he introduced a reform package developed by a task force that included community advocates, law enforcement specialists, a former federal civil rights investigator, and, at his insistence, residents whose earlier complaints had been closed without meaningful review. The reforms required updated training on civil rights law, de-escalation, and implicit bias for every active officer. They created an independent civilian complaint process, staffed by investigators without prior ties to department personnel. They expanded body camera requirements and introduced automatic activation safeguards. They also ordered an external audit of historical complaint files closed without findings. Darius presented the reforms in the same city hall room where he had addressed the arrest. The audience remained cautious. People had heard promises before. They listened with the tentative attention of residents who wanted to believe that change was possible but had learned not to confuse announcements with results. A veteran City Hall reporter asked whether the reforms would have happened without the incident on Bellwether Avenue. Darius studied him for a moment. "Some were already being discussed," he said, "but that is not really what you are asking." The reporter waited. "You are asking whether an injustice involving a mayor received a different response from the same injustice involving someone without institutional power." Darius paused before giving the answer everyone in the room already understood. Yes, the word landed without protection or qualification. That is the most difficult part of this story. I want to say what happened to me was exceptional. Lenora Hayes's findings prove otherwise. What was exceptional was the call that forced the system to respond. Everything before that call was painfully ordinary. Later, Darius returned to Bellwether Avenue. The visit was not arranged as a public gesture. The corridor simply lay between a community meeting and another inspection of the construction work, now supervised by a new oversight committee that included local business owners who had submitted the original complaints. Darius did not dress anonymously this time. He wore a suit jacket and carried a leather folder. Two plainclothes security officers followed at a respectful distance. It was a compromise he had accepted, not because his beliefs about public access had changed, but because Marin had made an ethical argument he could not dismiss. The street looked different only in the way a place changes after becoming part of a memory. The shops remained. The pavement remained. The damaged security cameras had been replaced as a practical result of the audit. A florist recognized him first. The diner customer who had filmed the encounter stood outside and offered a small nod. There was no ceremony, only the acknowledgement shared by people who had occupied the same place at the same moment and now carried the memory together. A child pointed toward him and tugged at her mother's sleeve. The mother bent close and whispered something Darius could not hear. He hoped it was accurate. Darius stopped near the place where he had stood with his hands on Grant's patrol car. He looked at the curb, the sidewalk, and the open street. He remembered the older man with the cane, the witness whose face had held recognition rather than surprise. High thought of all the people who had stood on similar sidewalks without a direct number capable of forcing anyone to listen. He opened his folder and wrote a single line in the same kind of paper notebook he had carried during the first inspection. "The work is the thing. Begin sooner, stay longer, never mistake the beginning for the end." Then he closed the notebook and continued walking. In the period that followed, Greyhaven began to understand something Darius had spent his administration trying to express through policy, budgets, and public meetings. The call that exposed Grant's mistake took only a moment. Documenting the pattern behind that mistake required a serious investigation. Changing the institutions that had protected it would take far longer. Some reforms would succeed, others would need revision. Some would uncover problems no one had anticipated and require the city to begin again. That was the ordinary texture of institutional change, slow, unglamorous, and impossible to complete in a single dramatic morning. It required the same attention Darius had brought to Bellwether Avenue, the willingness to examine what was actually present instead of accepting what official summaries claimed was there. Gradually, the complaint system began to change. More residents filed reports because more residents believed filing might matter. More reports received acknowledgement. More investigations reached genuine conclusions. Community review meetings included voices and experiences previously kept outside the room. In the revitalization corridor, the construction schedule was rewritten and monitored. Delayed pavement repairs were completed. Permits were updated. Cameras were replaced with equipment that functioned. Local businesses that had waited for the project to fulfill its promises began seeing measurable progress. Not every improvement resulted solely from what happened to Darius, but none was entirely disconnected from it. One afternoon, Darius returned to his office and found Marin standing at the window, looking across the skyline with the expression of someone carrying an answer she knew was incomplete but necessary. She turned as he entered. "Civic participation is rising," she said. "Complaint filings are up. Attendance at community review meetings has increased significantly throughout the corridor." Darius sat at his desk. "Good. It looks as though people believe someone is listening." "Someone is." Marin remained silent for a moment. "You could have taken someone with you that morning." "I know. Are you glad you didn't?" Darius thought of the man with the cane. He thought of the complaint files. He thought about the difference between understanding an injustice intellectually and knowing it through the body. "I am glad I know what I know now." Marin considered the answer, nodded once, gathered her folders, and left. Darius remained alone at his desk in the city he was trying to rebuild. He opened his notebook. He began earlier, stayed longer, and refused to confuse the beginning with the end. One call ended a career. What it opened was larger than what it closed. Greyhaven had postponed its reckoning for so long that the delay had begun to feel normal. The incident exposed the precise distance between power and accountability, and revealed that the distance remained only as wide as those holding power allowed it to remain. Darius had walked through his own city and been treated like a threat for doing so. High had stood with his hands against a police cruiser on a public street in the city he led. High had been handcuffed before witnesses who understood immediately what he would not fully know until he made that call from the station bench. His experience was not an anomaly. It was a frequency. Residents had been broadcasting on that frequency for a long time. Their signal had reached complaint desks, review boards, supervisors, and leadership offices. At every stage, it had been weakened, reclassified, filed, and forgotten somewhere between documentation and action. Darius refused to let that become only the story of what happened to him. High wanted it to become the last time such a story could remain unheard. Not through the force of one morning's drama, but through the slower and more lasting work of changing the architecture through which those stories traveled. The systems that received complaints, the people who evaluated them, the standards used to reach findings, the consequences that followed those findings, and the oversight needed to ensure accountability did not depend on the status of the person requesting it. High knew the work might outlast his administration. High intended to spend every remaining day in office trying anyway. Whenever that effort felt insufficient, he returned in memory to the older man standing at the curb with his cane, watching with an expression untouched by surprise. And Darius reminded himself that the absence of surprise was not the same as the absence of hope. Earning that hope began with the courage to acknowledge the truth.